Growing up in the mid to late 90s, the king of the consoles was the PlayStation. Everyone had it, and more often than not, everyone had it chipped, meaning you could play pirated games. This was especially true in the north of England. Oftentimes, you knew someone, or someone that you knew of someone who could make this happen. Like most people, I may have known a guy, but getting a console chipped was only the first part. You then wanted the games to go with it. These days, circumventing legality in order to obtain a game is no more than a Google search away. In the 90s, you had to put boots on the ground and physically visit someone. The guy or guys in question often hung around outdoor markets, and you could, say, go and visit these people. You'd often find them with a few printed sheets of white paper upon which were a typed list of PlayStation titles that you could purchase for around £5 in late 90s Great British pounds, so whatever that is in 2024 inflation. This is how I may have found Ronin Blade, as it was called in Europe. In America, it went by Soul of the Samurai. In Japan, it was known as Shin Jidaigeki Action Rasetsu no Ken, literally New Era Action Drama, Blade of the Rakshasa. What's a Rakshasa? Born from Hindu mythology, the Rakshasa are a race of malevolent beings who commit evil acts on Earth, but they are also known in the realms of Buddhist scripture too. I was at an age where a game's title alone, the guy's type list didn't have any accompanying box art, was all I had to draw me in. I knew Ronin was Japanese sounding and I liked Dragon Ball Z and Tenchu, so why not give it a go? I mean, the guy at the market had sold someone a copy of Ronin Blade. This entrepreneur had once described the game Guilty Gear as that one you run around a building in, getting it confused with Metal Gear Solid. On another occasion, he had been forced to do a runner, bulging suitcase full of CDs stuffed under his arm, as the police had arrived in an attempt to bust his operation. Thankfully, he returned the next week. But Ronin Blade, let's call it that from now on, released at the relative end of the PS1's lifecycle. No less than a year after its initial Japanese release, the PS2 would hit store shelves in the East. Developed by Konami Computer Entertainment Sapporo, back when Konami still made games, ha ha ha, but in 2024, we can't really make that joke any longer because Konami has dipped its withered foot back into the game dev pool. Ronin Blade's dual protagonist setup, or deuteragonist if you want to sound smart after having typed the question in Google, is similar to that of Resident Evil. It sees you either choosing the Ronin Kotaro or the Kunoichi Lin. The main thrust of the plot concerns the disappearance of a shipment of gold ingots belonging to the Bakufu, officials of the Shogun, in the Matsuna province. While we'll get into the details shortly, Kotaro has returned to his hometown to visit the grave of his parents, while Lin has disobeyed protocol to investigate the disappearance of Shogun spies in the region. Their paths eventually cross and they're forced into teaming up as they delve further into shady, supernatural goings-on. Directed by Shinichi Kudo, most of you will not be familiar with his pedigree or the majority of the development team themselves. Prior to Ronin Blade, he'd worked on Tokimeki Memorial, Taisen, Tokaidama. Just tried to find any Konami-centric talent who had not worked on the series, and yes, Koji Igarashi, I see you. After Ronin Blade, Shinichi Kudo is probably best known for being the main planner on Suikoden 5, and then one of the designers responsible for the mobile mega hit Puzzles and Dragons. During the 90s, the video game industry, particularly on the PlayStation, was dominated by a number of influential works. Games like Resident Evil and Final Fantasy struck the gaming pond like a boulder, sending out ripples through studios intent on making their own waves. In particular, we saw many Resident Evil clones emerge as publishers and devs wanted their piece of the decomposing zombie pie. Sure, the example may be Clock Tower, but while you had Capcom pumping out Resident Evil, Square threw their hat in the ring with Parasite Eve, and Konami, along with releasing Silent Hill in 1999, attempted to bolster this with Ronin Blade. Coverage at the time, as far as Western media goes, was quick to point out the comparisons. So, Resident Evil with samurais then, said the official New Zealand PlayStation magazine, but with a New Zealand accent. Or, better yet, an interesting attempt to flog Resident Evil in a kimono, according to PlayStation Plus. Should have put that on the box art. Technically, they're not wrong. A number of the hallmarks that Clock Tower and Resident Evil seem to codify make an appearance. Tank controls, which I'd say is more of a limitation at the time rather than a survival horror staple. fixed camera angles and pre-rendered backgrounds, mild inventory management thanks to items picked up in the game world, light puzzling, and of course, horror elements. When observed through a more modern lens, there's a tendency to compare Ronin Blade to Onimusha, which is a much fairer comparison. Painting Ronin Blade with Resi's brush is more of a soundbite. In my mind, a vulnerable character and scant resources define survival horror more than tank controls and fixed camera angles. You never feel weak during Ronin Blade. You end up slaying swaths of enemies from the get-go, and it lacks the decision-making inherent in survival horror. It's better to flee than fight. Ronin Blade's critical reception at the time was quite tepid, averaging a 63 on game rankings. Take that with a fistful of salt. Are you going to trust a 120-word 10 out of 10 review from Air Hendricks on GamePro, which carries as much insight as reading the back of the game case? Jay Bohr over at IGN, despite saying, "I got bored with it rather quickly," gave the game a 7.9, so never change IGN, but made the distinction that this was nothing like Tenchu and more akin to MGS, whatever that means. Over at GameSpot, Joe Fielder made the same distinction between Tenchu and said Resi was a more apt comparison. Praising the story, he found the fixed camera angles made the whole combat experience rather trying. While not a review, the preview of the game in PlayStation Plus issue 47 is worth a mention for the sheer density of Eastern puns it manages to fit in its article. It's easy to look back at the relatively recent past through our noses, atop our high horses. Regarding a bunch of old reviews, I don't find them offensive, more so a time capsule when Eastern culture started becoming more widespread. The author describes Ronin Blade as combining samurai-style swordplay and a hardcore kung fu film plot, clocking in at the serious end of the chop-socky scale. It reminds me of the presenters vamping on an introduction for a Jackie Chan or Jet Li film that was about to play on TV when I was a kid. Ultimately, in its reviews, it could not escape the shadow of the Resident Evil series, or even Tenchu, which feels like a mirror looking into itself.
Oh my god! Oh my god! Oh my god!
So yeah, Ronin Blade is a bit of an oddity. Not survival horror enough to sit and play with Leon or Nemesis, but not fast-paced actiony enough to fit in alongside your Spider-Mans, Brave Fence Musashis, or Medieval. If you went into Ronin Blade expecting a game that neatly fit at one end of either of these spectrums, you'd be disappointed. It may seem designed to isolate at first glance. However, if you're willing to take the game on its own merits, then there are some things to like, but not love. Combat, for the most part, is serviceable. It can feel a little stiff owing to the tank controls, but I consider them as trees lining the limiting landscape at the time. Those limitations bled into the characters. Not enough is done to distinguish Kataro and Lin's fighting styles. Instead, we're mostly engaging with the same types of standard sword-wielding enemies from when we start to when we finish. There's a lack of growth in almost every place, though you do feel like you've mastered Ronin Blade's combat system by the end. Its story is honestly quite promising, and though characters like Lin and Kataro don't get too much narrative depth, the stories based around them have small yet brittle arcs. Their representation may come off as stereotypes because, well, they are, and the game doesn't give them enough time to be anything but that. And you'll get through the game at quite a quick pace. It's around an hour and a half for each character. In Resident Evil 2, for instance, a rough playthrough time when doing mostly everything with just Leon is probably around the 2.5 hour mark, and that's if you know what you're doing. And with little incentive to replay the scenarios, no difficulty changes or extras, it's really a one and done game. But saying all that, Ronin Blade does have a bit of charm that manages to elevate it from being a bad game to a fairly serviceable experience that was rather unique to the platform at the time. Where else were you going to find a survival horror tinged Jidaigeki game? Well, nowhere, until Onimusha came along and did everything that Ronin Blade did, but better. So with that said, put on your best kimono, holster your sharpest katana, and kiss your waifu or husbando goodbye, because we're about to slice up some gaijin. Sushi. Ronin Blade's story setup is pretty sparse. If you've not read the manual, which is nigh impossible to come by online, you can piece together the narrative simply by playing the game. Our tale is set during the end of the Edo period, an often popular period for Jidaigeki works. Films, TV, literature, theatre, and games that fall under the banner of Jidaigeki are those which take place before the Meiji Restoration of 1868. If you're looking for famous Jidaigeki films, then you wouldn't go wrong with Kurosawa's Seven Samurai, Throne of Blood, Yojimbo. These films and more would also fall into the Chambara sword fighting subgenre too. The hallmarks of this subgenre fits Ronin Blade's narrative to a T. There's a focus on the Tokugawa era, heralding the end of the samurai way of life. Furthermore, Ronin Blade's aesthetic and narrative thrust has a lot more in common with the Lone Wolf and Cub series than Kurosawa's films, though they both duel on that same Chambara battlefield. As we touched on before, what kickstarts the plot is that a ship filled with the shogun's gold has disappeared in the province of Matsuna, encompassing the land and in particular the village that Lord Tojo oversees. While Lin's reasons for coming here are both personal and professional, Kataro's just heading back home to visit the grave of his parents. While the game offers you a choice between Kotaro and Lin just after you begin a new playthrough, it makes the most sense to cover the game as a whole rather than separately. Apart, their narratives feel disjointed and strangely paced. Together, we find a more cohesive tale to tell. We begin with the roar of thunder and drone of rain lashing the ground as Lin, a kunoichi, rushes through the village's streets. Seemingly on the lookout for an unseen threat, she draws her blade. Cut to Kotaro busting out a sufficiently manly catwalk from the village's entrance as the ring of clashing steel reaches above the downpour. He finds Lin busy cutting down what goes for law in this village, and Kataro's all too willing to backstab an unsuspecting officer in the name of evening the odds. In a testament to his power, Kotaro cuts the dude down without even unsheathing his sword. The Ronin offers to give her a hand, and we're thrust into Ronin Blade's first battle against two lawmen. As Kotaro, we can add their number to the growing pile of corpses in short order. After a brief exchange of words, as more guards close in, we're now left to choose our character. So who's it going to be, Kotaro or Lin? Let's kick things off with Mr. Ponytail in Chapter 1, Homecoming. As all chapters do in Ronin Blade, we're delivered a literal wall or perhaps marble flooring of text summarizing where we're at. We are Kotaro Hiba, a masterless samurai in training. We've returned to the village to pay our respects to Ma and Pa when we're caught up in some shenanigans with a young girl and the law. Despite all that, Kotaro's got a rendezvous with his old pal Yukinosuke, a childhood friend at a nearby dojo. Now we're off. But wind it back just a moment. There's something you might have caught with the general wording of that bit of text. A masterless samurai in training sounds a little off. Sounds like Kotaro is training how to be a Ronin, like he's cramming for an upcoming test at Ronin school where he has to slice open a watermelon. It's a nitpick for sure, but in the Japanese it's a little clearer in saying that Kotaro is a Ronin who has chosen to continue his training alone. In our journey to visit Yukinosuke, we can acquaint ourselves with Ronin Blade's systems. Firstly, you'll have already noticed the lovely pre-rendered backgrounds. The village, while looking a little downtrodden and not exactly thriving, sure does look nice in all its PSX glory. I'm running this on a DuckStation emulator without having cranked up too many settings, more so for the character models than anything else. Oh, I have slightly increased the emulator speed, which will bite me in the arse later. For now, we have more pressing concerns like seeking out our friend. As was the style at the time, Kotaro's wielding the power of the tank to do so. Tank controls often went hand in hand with pre-rendered backgrounds, and we're not shirking tradition here. Forward on the D-pad puts gas on the pedal, left and right alters your bearing, and back has you shuffling backwards. Depending on the screen you're currently on, movement at times can feel more akin to a side-scrolling beat-em-up rather than a more boxy arena. If you hold L1 and move, Kotaro will run, adopting a classic warrior stance as he does so. We cut our way through the throng and dip into an alley to find the entrance to Yukinosuke's dojo. Kotaro's pretty blasé about murdering the officials, convinced they were in the wrong and finding something odd about their eyes. Yukinosuke, rather than appearing too shocked, figured that's pretty standard behavior for his old friend. The two spare a moment to reminisce, and this is your formal chance to acquaint yourself with Ronin Blade's combat. It's actually quite a nice diegetic way to tutorialize it in game. I love how Kid Kotaro and Kid Yukinosuke have basically tailored their exact drip as they've grown up. As you've been racing in and out of various pre-rendered arenas, you will have likely encountered sparse clutches of lawmen, or yakunin as the Japanese calls them, to get a feel for combat. Yakunin is the word for government officials, so they work at the behest of Tojo. You'll quickly find that combat is a mostly simple affair in Ronin Blade. Your basic katana allows you to reel off several attacks, though the exact weapon you're currently using can alter the number of attacks slightly. You also have access to a thrust and jumping attack. While the former is good as a poke, the jumping attack outside of specific use cases isn't too effective. What is effective is your sidestep slash, which you can use to combo into your regular attacks. However, the undoubtedly coolest move to pull off is the deadly counter. It can be a little counterintuitive. You generally feel like you should block before an attack comes in. Not so. You instead hold block and then tap square just as the opponent's blade or weapon inches closer to yours. While it will one-shot regular scrubs, it won't on bosses, though it'll deal a fair chunk of damage. Kotaro can practice these various techniques while wailing on Yukinosuke with his shinai, which is those bamboo swords they use in kendo. When you've had your fill, the master comes rushing in looking more glazed over than a donut. Some of that glaze has dripped onto Yukinosuke because he seems a little distracted as Kotaro's telling him about visiting his parents. His friend appears somewhat apprehensive about the pilgrimage, going so far as a poor attempt to dissuade him. Undeterred, Kotaro heads out only to find Ryu Oda, a military scholar, hanging by the door. Though he wonders if Kotaro is up for joining his Lord Tojo's cause, the Ronin's having none of it, sensing there's another war on the horizon. Ryo informs Yukinosuke of his lord's summons, before cryptically asking about the effects of a recent medical procedure. Surely that doesn't mean anything. Back outside, pounding the village streets towards the graveyard, you should have noticed your HUD by now. The green bar's your health, the blue power functions as a special meter, the yellow's your experience. As you level up by defeating enemies, Kotaro will learn different special techniques that he can expend blue chunks to unleash, varying in cost. There is a finite number of times that you can level up, thus learning everything, and there's plenty of guards to go around, so there's no need to grind at any point in the game. Your eye was also probably drawn to the bottom right of the screen, your items. Like a Resi game, you can heal with herbs and other sundry items varying in potency. If you're Lin, you get access to a few ninja-specific items too. On the way to the graveyard, it's easy to get lost. You may have already brought up your map to help combat this and notice the game's layout, at least from the map perspective, appears more like a dungeon with various rooms or chambers. In the non-Japanese version, the map starts quite sparse and then fills up as you traverse each screen. In the Japanese, it's already filled out for you. How nice of Konami. Upon cutting down one in a long line of lawmen, Kotaro just can't get over the creepy aura they're giving off. No sooner has he sheathed his blade and wandered away, does the fallen official seemingly reanimate and spews several bloody bugs out of his mouth, and now things are getting nightmarish. Not content with sticking his nose in ninja business, Kotaro stumbles upon a komuso, a monk wearing a tengai straw hat to show their divorce from material desire. While usually seen begging for coin and playing the shakuhachi flute, this one's busy begging for his life. When Kotaro's busy slicing these guys up, the monk just kinda sits there in the corner like an unattended child watching his dad brawl with some geezers outside of a pub. Despite our best efforts to save the monk's life, a guy in purple shows up and promptly sends him to Nirvana. We're thrust into our first proper boss battle. When the blue bar's thrown up, Ronin Blade may feel more like a round of Soul Calibur or Bushido Blade. You're often confined to much tighter arenas in these instances, the constricted spaces and general difficulty increase making battles feel a little more cinematic. The clash with the warrior is pretty tame, easing you into how more high stakes encounters will unfold. You may have noticed so far that as you've been dashing about, rarely are you confronted by more than 2 enemies at a time. In that same vein, the training wheels are still on. This guy won't truly test your metal or deal too much damage, but his special does reveal perhaps the smuggest pixelated face I've ever seen. Towards the end of the fight, this guy will start spamming the attack, so you best have practiced your sidestepping. For coming out on top, you'll receive your first of many swords, the Monohoshizao. We'll get into this blade and how the different weapons function in a moment. There's just a monk that needs his last rites. Not long for this material plane, he hands a letter over to Kotaro, asking him to deliver it to one of his colleagues in his stead. Just before breathing his last, he mentions bugs, and we've just seen some of those bad boys. Not to nitpick too much, translations were super under-prioritized back in the day, with translators barely having any time, but the use of colleague just sounds a bit weird. It makes it sound like the monks work in an office and he's just handed Kotaro like the latest sales report. This isn't to make fun of the translation or anything like that. There's just little interesting things that pop up every now and then. Colleague is taken from nakama, which can and does have that definition. but can also be translated as companion or comrade or something like that. But with the word bug rattling around Kataro's head, he's got a mystery to uncover. I wonder if Lin has any connection to these strange goings on in the village. The last time we saw her, she'd been surrounded by officials intent on hacking her into bite-sized chunks, but it turns out that when word of the Shogun's gold disappearing made its way back to Edo, a ninja, Shin, was sent to investigate. Upon his disappearance, 3 more were dispatched. Unbeknownst to them all, however, Lin has decided to tag along too to find her brother Shin. As Lin, we begin close to the village square. From briefly playing around, you'll notice she's got speed on the Ronin Kataro. Her attacks are quicker and often have more strings. She can jump higher too, which will come in handy later on. On top of that, Lin has access to various ninja tools that she can wield. We start off with the ninja staple, the kunai. Lin won't be able to break out her ninja arsenal just yet though. Her first mission is one often glossed over with games featuring ninja, intelligence gathering. Ronin Blade's not exactly explicit about the order, however. If you try to leave the square, you'll be advised to stay a while and chat. You can speak to various village folk, including the same caked up character model used for Kataro's instructor. If you approach the central watchtower, a golden Buddha statue sits at its center. Growing at its feet is a flower. I'm not sure if this is meant to be a reference to a specific plant because it was created in an age where you really had to keep that poly count low. Maybe it's a licorice squamigera? I probably did not pronounce that right, known as the resurrection lily. The licorice plant has quite a significant history in Japan, so I don't think it's too far of a stretch to assume that this is what we're looking at. But the purpose of the flowers is to act as your save point. Though it's more than a save point, it is a haiku dispenser. Depending on your character and progression in the game, the haiku that you receive changes. The cool thing is, in the Japanese version, the same system is presented as if you're writing the haiku, but it just wouldn't have transferred to the Western release for practical UI reasons. You can talk to pretty much everyone in the village square until Lin says that she has the information required in order to reach the moored ship. When you exit the area, she'll reminisce about her brother, acting as another diegetic opportunity to familiarize yourself with how she plays. Her moveset on the whole is analogous to Kataro, though I do prefer her ability to use items and general snappier nature of her attacks. If you'd previously completed the game with Kataro and then jumped into her story or vice versa, all those skills you've learned are transferable. Lin beats a path through the village along a side street where she finds one of the spies dispatched, Hanzo, sitting in a pool of his own blood. Her best efforts to patch him up are soon interrupted by a couple of officials. A few moments later, you're thrust into Lin's first boss battle. While not super difficult, it is easy for you to get flustered by the near 2D plane you're fighting on. Guards will often stab you in the back while you're busy tackling immediate threats. Of course, Lin's victorious in the end and can finish her catch-up with Hanzo. The dying spy has a few salient bits of intel. Number 1, Tojo knew the identity of the spies before they arrived, thus getting the drop on them. And number 2, Tojo's behind the ransacking of the Shogun's gold. The remaining spies, Genzo and Ken, are following up on just how the lord of this fiefdom is intending to use those ill-gotten gains. Hanzo, meanwhile, was looking for a sword, Rakyo, which was accompanying the gold. When he promptly keels over a moment later, Lin chooses to shoulder his burden, bringing an end to her first chapter. When we last saw Kataro, he'd just visited Yukinosuke to catch up. After a brief chinwag, Kataro shared his intention to visit his parents' grave, despite Yukinosuke's light protests. On the way out, we were also introduced to Ryu Oda, a military scholar working for Tojo. Uninterested in his offer to join the Lord's ranks, Kataro told Yukinosuke to break out the sake for his return. Regardless if he chose Lin or Kataro, their chapter 2 begins the same, a meeting by the town watchtower. The two congratulate each other on having survived so far, and depending on whose story you're playing through, the scene has a few changes. Kataro wonders if Lin is the colleague that the dying monk spoke of. Lin simply feels that she can't stand around yapping. Ready to leave, she's stopped when Kataro pulls out the letter the Komaso passed him. Lin recognizes it as the cipher they'd employed for communication. Not like she's going to share that bit of intel with Kataro though. Ronin tries to pry into a business a little further, likening Lin to a sister he wishes to protect. But Lin's a big girl and can manage just fine by herself. She bows in thanks before rushing off, leaving Kataro to continue his pilgrimage. But just before we visit our parents, they're not going anywhere, let's check out that new sword. The Monohoshizao literally translates to laundry pole, as its description states. The Ronin Blade doesn't explicitly give you the identity of the Ronin that you fought earlier, it hints it here. Sasaki Kojiro. Though he was a real historical figure, the exact dates surrounding his deeds can't be pinned down. What most may know him for is his duel with a more widely known swordsman, Musashi Miyamoto. The nadachi he used in battle was longer than your average 90cm katana by around 20 centimeters. I believe the special move the Ronin uses in his duel with Kitaro is based on his famed Swallow Cut, a lightning-fast slash. If you played a game like Samurai Warriors, in which both Musashi Miyamoto and Sasaki Kojiro appear, or watch the fairly recent Onimusha anime on Netflix, you'll be familiar with their rivalry. Sasaki is often painted as the antagonist in these depictions, though, if anything, Sasaki was the famed swordsman who ran his own dojo. The blade itself is decent enough. Range is always important, and if you can poke further than your opponent, you're apt to survive longer. The Monohoshizao does come in rather handy for a specific event later on, but for now, it's simply the best weapon we have. Damage is not explicitly quantified in Ronin Blade. Your best indicator of a weapon's combat efficacy goes dull, ordinary, good, excellent. To further differentiate weapons, they may also have a number of magical modifiers that we'll get our hands on soon enough. After testing out the laundry pole by hanging some officers out to dry, Kitaro finally arrives at the shrine. At its gate, a young woman, Kurenai, approaches him. Intending to visit her mother's grave, she feels there's something a little funky in the air at the shrine, so literally asks if she can tag along. Our stone-cold Ronin has no qualms, so chooses to play the Yojimbo for a while. But just as we're climbing the steps, we run into a couple of lawmen blocking our path. Even though the two parties exchange words, we always knew Kitaro was going to let his blade do the talking in the end. Despite the fact that Kitaro has Tojo's lackeys on his back, Kurenai still insists on following us. It's her mother's anniversary. You'll notice that Kurenai will still be by your side after this fight, and the screen will display her health. If you let her get too many hits, she'll join her mother. The laundry pole is quite effective in the next section because it consists of a number of tight areas, meaning the blade can often cleave multiple enemies at the same time. On the temple path, you'll notice area staples such as the Ishidori, the lanterns, and a rather abundant number of seals plastered to the gates. When Kitaro approaches the temple shrine, a new enemy drops down, a ninja. These guys are more nimble in their movement, often hopping about the battleground, and they tend to fire off projectiles. It's inside the shrine that Ronin Blade really plants its horror roots, with a bed full of corpses piled on top of each other. Even slightly upscaled, what you're looking at is still so ambiguously grotesque. It's blood and fabric and what looks like limbs just jutting out. There's no time to stop and stare. A bunch more ninja drop in from the rafters, and once they're slain, you'll find a key. It's the most Resident Evil-ish thing so far. I mentioned way back when, but this game was often likened to the seminal horror series. But have things really mirrored the game that much? Has Kitaro or Lin felt like they're overcoming the odds, short on firepower and healing supplies, where it's sometimes better to dip from danger completely? I'm gonna say not really. So far, we've been scything through dudes and generally feeling every bit the skillful Ronin or agile Kunoichi. Kitaro grabs another key from a room next to the shrine before the two venture deeper into the temple. You can ransack a few rooms and fight more ninja and officials before exiting to the rear of the area. Those two keys you swiped are used to unlock a large iron gate at the top of a set of stairs, and Kurenai's finally decided to pull her weight by offering to unlock them for you. Nothing bad could come of that, surely. As the door unlocks, Kurenai unleashes a scream, and now it's Kitaro's problem. The Ronin rushes up the steps, finding more guards in his way, and we slowly reach the graveyard proper. The biggest priest I have ever seen, giving me El Gigante vibes from Resi 4, bars our path. From the conversation, Kitaro recognizes the man from his youth, though he's grown a bit since then. You can divide boss battles in Ronin Blade into two camps, fair and bullshit. This is the latter. You're fighting a giant enemy in a very cramped arena. The priest swings big and has an extremely annoying belly flop attack that has some modest tracking to it. Expect to get flattened often. Of course, like many bosses do in some games, he has no hit stun, so will gladly swat you across the head mid-combo. He also has a poison jab attack, so I hope you were lucky enough to snag an antidote along the way. While trying to run around the boss may seem tempting, you're probably better off sidestepping his blows. Eventually, when he's off to a better place, so too are the bugs that infested him. When Kitaro checks on Kurenai, it seems that a number of corpses have been exhumed and carted off to inside a dark cave nearby. Kurenai pleads with Kitaro not to go, but his mind's made up. Before leaving, she tells him if he survives, to come visit her at a blacksmith shop at the edge of town. If we make it out alive, we may just do that. Lin's just got on an next lead, courtesy of Kotaro, the dead monk, who was actually one of the spies, Genzo. In his possession was a ciphered letter. The letter is his testimony confirming that Lord Tojo has raided the ship, and though the game isn't very clear, our next mission is to search the surrounding houses for clues. The house in question is to the south. Inside, while there are numerous things to interact with, I believe you only have to hit a few text triggers in order to actually advance the plot. When Lin next heads outside, she comes face to face with everyone's favourite monk, Genzo. But didn't Kotaro say Genzo was dead? Not quite. He pops off his Tengai to reveal a very zombified face. The following battle isn't much of a challenge. Genzo's put his Tengai back on for a moment though. The zombie lacks any decent moves and Lin's simply too quick for him to cause much trouble. When he's lost enough health, it's cool that you even knock his Tengai off before hopefully sending him to the afterlife for real this time. Sticking with Lin after that rather short chapter, her mission now is to head to the beach to locate the ship. The path is anything but straightforward, however. She needs to trudge through a dense forest. Shigure, her new weapon, should make the task a little easier. Like the laundry pole, it's equipped with a little more range, but is just as dull. As with Kotaro when visiting the shrine, Tojo's now unleashed his ninja forces. They're still just as quick, but Lin's quicker. Though the alleyways and streets can often be a bit tight, as long as you're making judicious use of her strafing abilities, you can get by relatively unscathed. Our destination is actually back where Hanzo fell. Just a little further on is a forest entrance. Upon arriving, a lone crow squawks behind a torii gate laden with shide, paper charms. The forest itself is quite a beautiful environment. Though the parallel is quite obvious, it often reminds me of the ones in Onimusha. You will find lumber piled at the side of pathways, little bridges over streams, and dosojin as a means of supernatural protection for travellers. So it's a little ironic that when Lin steps close, 3 strange raven-like kunoichi drop down. They feel a little more souped up than regular ninjas, making them as good a target as any for Lin's various ninja projectiles. From one of the dosojin along the way, Lin can scoop up an iron key that will come in handy shortly. There are a total of 3 iron keys, including the one we just picked up. You'll find them by the squat shrines if you choose to fully explore the area. If you effectively complete this chapter without using them, they will automatically disappear from your inventory. So what are they for? Well, through an offshoot of a trail, you can discover a shrine. At the little altar before it is a set of gold keys. Picking these up shuts the wooden door behind you. The only way to open the door would be to put the gold keys back, unless you use the 3 iron keys instead. This means you can leave with the gold keys. Trekking through the forest takes Lin to a scaffolded area where the leader of those raven ninja finally shows herself. Karasu is literally the word for crow or raven. Karasu seems to know something about Lin's brother Shin, but of course, she's not willing to spill anything without a fight. Karasu is Lin's most technical opponent so far. She combines the agility of the kunoichi with an ability to levitate and fire projectiles. When not fighting fair on the ground, she'll often hop back to the scaffolding and launch several kunai that you're forced to dodge. It's due to this that the battle feels a little stop and start. You spend most of your time strafing back and forth along the quite narrow stretch, popping off a few hits at a time. But as we've witnessed so far in Ronin Blade, death isn't necessarily the end. When you've landed the first killing blow, Karasu transforms, becoming more raven than human. I'm not quite sure what it adds to the fight. She's annoyingly floated around before now, but for some reason she can do it with more ease, I guess. I mean, I think her attacks are more powerful, but her ability to fly does affect the battle to a tangible degree. If she started floating after her first death, then perhaps that would have added an interesting dimension. With Karasu's dying breath, she tells Lin that Shin is down at the beach. Heading down this trail, you'll find a large wooden door. Remember those gold keys? They open this door, and inside, we'll find Ken, who appears very dead. On him is the clown code letter, one of the 3 letters that Lin can obtain. I think you can use it to get a clue to where the helmet code letter is, but that only becomes relevant later on. Right now, with the scent of salt in the air, Lin's not got far to go. Unfortunately for Kotaro, he's not getting any ocean spray, but the musty, decaying scent of a cave. After the rope snaps on his way to investigate the recently disinterred corpses from the nearby graveyard, he's now searching for a way out. This chapter is the most frustrating in gameplay and in its battles. We do have a little help though. Our new blade, Osofune. The Bizen Osofune, Bizen being the region, is renowned for their blacksmith quality. If you fancy seeing them in real life, you can visit the Bizen Osofune Sword Museum in Okayama. Caves can be a pain in games. You often lack a map and can end up running around in circles for ages. This cave in particular reminds me of the ones you would traverse in Sekiro, replete with the agonized yell of some ungodly creature as you enter. As you traverse the often confusing and near identical pathways, you'll stumble upon some stumbling zombies. Kinda reminds me of the ones from Nightmare Creatures. Osafune makes quick work of them, which is good because you may find yourself running to and fro, just trying to make sense of your direction. You'll eventually reach a split. Going either left or right leads to a small rocky outcropping and a mound of flattened corpses below. Like a crow, you're attracted to the blue shiny thing, only for the game to drop an enemy out of nowhere for you to fight. Not too bad, and you're rewarded with an archer figure. But it's the left path that will absolutely debate you. As you cross the threshold, Kotaro will slowly slide towards a very deep pit. And if there was one thing tank controls were not designed for, it's reflexive movement. I can't tell you how many times I saw Kotaro plummet to the bottom of that pit. You basically need to position yourself facing the exit and kind of moonwalk in order to pick up the next figurine. In true survival horror fashion, I wouldn't even call it survival horror fashion. The idea of looking around an area for an item that you need to put in another place to progress feels like it's conflated with the survival horror genre for some reason. In reality, there have been a ton of games where you require an item to progress. It's such a basic fundamental thing. It's just a way of padding out game time and forcing you to explore an area. The searching that you participate in within the confines of a survival horror game feels more Metroidvania-like, where you're asked to remember specific places or interactions so that when you find the requisite item, you're struck by an, oh yeah, that's what it's for. That kind of reaction works best when you're patrolling more labyrinthine areas like the mansions, like the police station, rather than a simple cave environment. Anyway, we've got a couple of statues and they'll fit nicely on a pedestal. You may have already taken a turn into this area earlier. When you place the statues in their depressions, you'll hear a clunk. Like this pathway, you may have also found a steel door on your spelunking. We never question why games have these convoluted methods of opening passages and locked doors. It's accepted. How many people question why you need medals to open up an underground passage in the Raccoon City Police Department? Kotaro heads through the door and finds himself in a dark grotto with emaciated and possibly zombified corpses face down in the water. A moment later, they are up and shuffling about. With a taste for brains and Kotaro's ankles, you've no choice but to slay them. More bugs spew forth, squashed under Kotaro's zori, those thonged sandals. Turns out the old guy floating in the purple drip does not like us standing on his soul bugs. The interesting thing to me, anyway, is that in the Japanese they're called Hankonchu, anti-soul insect. It uses an outdated version of the kanji for bug, mushi, which fits with the saying. So it sounds more like they're stealing the soul from their victim to leave it as a soulless husk, rather than a soul bug, which might be more ambiguous but seems like a decent enough compromise. The sorcerer, named Urabe, reveals that this place is where soul bugs are born, their nest, and from here they enter their host. According to Urabe, they're having smashing fun, all at the behest of Lord Tojo. So now we gotta fight, in a purple void to match Urabe's purple getup. First things first, this fight is pure, unadulterated bullshit. This old dude will fly about, making him a pain to hit. He can cast lightning bolts as well as turn the ground into a thunder mine. He'll periodically send flaming geysers up as well, and he won't let you get more than one hit on him at a time. When his health's low enough, he'll fly around the arena like an enraged wasp, dropping rocks on your head. What's worse is that you can get stun locked because if he continues to reel off the same style of attack, once you've recovered from the knockdown, you'll just get hit again. The classic boss thing happened here. You do pretty well on the first time and then, for whatever reason, degenerate into hot ass the following attempts. I had a few healing items, but was forced to burn through pretty much all my herbs and ointments and still barely scratched him. Ronin Blade is not admittedly a difficult game, but this dude is just unbalanced. I legitimately looked up strats on how to beat him. The only really effective way is to unleash your spinning eagle special attack for the most optimal bang for your buck. When Urabe is finally down, the cave begins to crumble. Kotaro makes a swift exit, leaving Urabe to die amongst his beloved soul bugs, but not before he's visited by Ryu Oda, who's menacingly standing on a rock over yonder. The old sorcerer wants a word with Tojo to plead his case. Unfortunately, Ryu Oda's already created a colony of soul bugs all on his own. Furious and betrayed, Urabe calls on the last remaining strength and his beloved soul bugs in order to cut off Kotaro's escape. With rocks crashing down around him, the Ronin makes for the exit, only for the newly transformed Urabe to appear, who is so pissed that he has combusted. Our new blade, Ran-un, is just what the sorcerer ordered. Infused with lightning and sharper than the Osafune, this is our best bet at taking down Urabe once again. Time's ticking away though, 3 minutes to be exact. Thankfully, he's not that difficult. You can just keep spamming attack and he'll barely get a hit in. For defeating Urabe again, you'll receive the Doji Kiri, literally Doji Cutter, for having supposedly slain the mythical Oni Shuten Doji. The one said to be doing the slaying was allegedly Minamoto no Raiko, a Japanese folk hero. In fact, this blade is real, folktale notwithstanding. Its real name is slightly different, Dojikiri, because of how Japanese grammar works, but it's a national treasure of Japan. The history of the blade's pretty interesting. Real life lore doesn't say anything about the blade being able to conjure fire though. To escape the cave, Kotaro must head to a dead end, though I'm not sure how the player is supposed to intuit that. Either way, you have just enough time to brute force every passageway. Upon reaching potential salvation, all Kotaro can do is climb. Back with Lin, it's everyone's favourite part of any anime or manga, the beach episode. The ninjas who had previously tried to stop her journey have been dealt with, so now she just needs to find her brother Shin. Arriving at the beach, Lin finds chunks of flotsam bobbing on waters and a large vessel that's run aground. Seems like the intel was right. Here you'll encounter more ninja hanging about by fish drying on racks. They're much more agile than what Kotaro's been fighting, which makes for a nice switch up. Down at the beach, a new type of enemy appears, ninja wielding tekokagi, those long claws. They can take more punishment but tend to go down all the same. After skirting around the beach, Lin scuttles through a small area featuring several huts in order to sneak up on Ryu Oda and finally Lord Tojo. While the majority of the gold has been siphoned from the vessel, it seems that the mysterious blade, Rakyo, was already pilfered. At the mention of the sword, Lin's heard enough and introduces herself. Tojo's both unimpressed by the ninja and by whatever retribution the shogun could muster. Oda summons a couple of guards who look a lot like Baraka from Mortal Kombat. These guys are like hopped up claw ninjas. They're faster and also have the ability to teleport away. However, they do like to try to dogpile Lin, which is a great opportunity to lob an exploding kunai their way. It can be a risk trying to keep your distance between them. One of the pitfalls of having quick select items in only one slot means you're sometimes awkwardly hammering R2 to cycle through the items and heal yourself. When the last of the Baraka clones are eating sand, we're in for a reunion. But Shin, in his badass pose along the bowsprit, is lacking in brotherly love. He drops down, firing off a few harsh words before vanishing. You have a moment or two to grab a healing item and save your game before giving chase. Once you've made it back to the other end of the beach, Shin's there ready to duel. For some reason, he defected to the side of Tojo, wanting to bring about war with the shogun so the man could rule. Now we know who the person was that tipped off Tojo about the spies. Even still, none of this is making any sense to Lin, and though she tries to reason with him, Shin says it's his duty as a brother to kill her. I'm an only child, so someone will have to tell me if that's actually in the sibling code. In the Japanese, he's kind of like, you'll die by your brother's hand. The battle with Shin is similar to those mirror battles in games where you're facing an opponent that has generally the same capabilities as yourself, albeit more powerful. He has a kunai attack which sends several red blades forward, only before they act like a boomerang and double back. Shin can zip around the arena, sidestep, and even deflect some of the blows as you're comboing him. Similar to the Ronin that Kotaro fought early in his story, Shin can charge with his blade to deliver a lightning quick attack moments later, which you're forced to time your dodge to avoid. The fight's probably the best Lin's had so far. Mirror battles usually are, because you're utilizing the knowledge you've gained from playing a character and weaving it into your battle strategy. But your bro doesn't have a ton of health, and Lin's so quick, she can often get a string of attacks off before a reply. Eventually, there's only one way this fight was going to end, with Shin on his back in a pool of blood. When Lin asks him why he did this, he's like, "Saw bugs, babe, didn't you hear?" After being infected, the bugs unearth Shin's deep-seated desire to kill, making him the perfect puppet for Tojo. Why exactly people like Shin can be infected with the soul bugs and still keep some semblance of themselves, unlike the lawmen or zombies who seem totally possessed, we don't quite know. Lin pleads for her brother to hang on, but after making his apologies, he's off to meet Genzo and the others. With all the spies now dead, our lone ninja may have to put an end to Tojo on a lonesome. Kotaro's just managed to crawl out of the cave only to emerge below the watchtower in the village square. Inhabitants are running for their lives. It seems any illusions Tojo had of masking their true plans have now faded. Infected corpses have overrun the square and we've got just the thing to put them down. You're now in a kind of minigame of sorts. You have a fixed amount of time to kill as many of the infected as possible. Ronin Blade doesn't tell you this, however. If you're able to slaughter over 300 zombies, then you'll be rewarded with a rusty sword. Now, this is where I screwed up. I mentioned before I tinkered with the settings in order to get a higher frame rate. In doing this, it sped up the game. This meant time ticks down quicker than the increased speed of your actions can make up for. What does this mean? It means that I could not get the requisite number of kills in order to get the blade. I was maxing out at around 240 and using the best weapon for the situation, the laundry pole. It's definitely possible, however, because I did it way back when on the original PSX. And for some perspective, a medium-ish sized village may have a population of around, being generous, 1,500 people. If Kotaro slaughtered 300 of these, and I'm not counting them as corpses from the graveyard, it's around 20% of the population, so good going, I guess. After the hordes have died down, you can head to the left of the watchtower, where a long-haired man will challenge you to a duel at Ganryu Beach. His patience is finite. If you don't travel there before taking on the castle, he'll simply have grown tired of you and left. But as Kotaro roams around the village, he'll encounter a few new varieties of enemy. Gone are the lawmen, replaced with the zombies from the cave and a new form of mutant with a giant arm. Dojikiri will put in a shift against both of these foes. Aside from more health, the newer, greener dudes aren't too much to worry about, nor are the other zombie warriors who split in half after sustaining a few good hits. As Kotaro heads up one particular path, he'll find Ito, a dressmaker, being stalked by a couple of enemies. We want to save this guy. If we're successful, he'll agree to sort us out with a new fit. You can cycle through a number of costumes for Kotaro, but I always was partial to his black ninja-like getup. Suitably dressed, Kotaro can head to the beach via the same forest path that Lin took. It's here, by the forest's entrance, you can find the blacksmith that Kun and I spoke of. If you have the rusty blade, you can hand it over to him, and he'll work his magic on it to receive the sword later. It's a good blade, don't get me wrong, but I couldn't get it. It's on par with another you can get later, however. Ninja and flying poison bat creatures stand in your way, but they should be no match whatsoever for Kotaro. Upon reaching the beach, you'll come face to face with the warrior, Masashi. Presumably, this is Masashi Miyamoto, the legendary swordsman. He's not being hired by Tojo, he's just here for the love of the fight and deems Kotaro a worthy opponent. The irony here is that in his duel with Sasaki Kojiro, Sasaki was the one made to wait on the beach for Masashi, who allegedly kept him waiting for over 3 hours just to piss him off. As I said before, if you leave Masashi hanging, he'll simply get annoyed and dip. Another homage is that in the legendary duel with Sasaki, the two fought on a beach as well. It's said that Masashi basically twatted Sasaki Kojiro on the head with an oar that he'd fashioned into a bokken, a wooden sword often used in sword practice. Instead of a giant oar, you'll notice that Masashi wields 2 blades. In the majority of his incarnations, he'll dual wield because of his own Niten Ichi, 2 heavens as one, Kenjutsu. This style made use of a longer katana and the shorter wakizashi, which you can just about make out in the game. The fight with Masashi is one of Ronin Blade's most dueliest of duels. The swordmaster's quick, though his blades don't have great range. He'll dodge around the beach, charge up a few unblockable specials, and mix in the odd thrust. Unfortunately, as a bit of foreshadowing, you may notice that Masashi can't combo so well. It's mainly a rapid flurry of attacks. Most of the time, Kotaro is capable of getting in far more consistent hits than his opponent. For a legendary warrior, Masashi's probably a little too easy to defeat. Ronin Blade executes a much better duel like this a little later in the game. Upon his death, Masashi confers his dual blades onto us, Kogurasamaru and Onimaru. The former, known as Little Crow Circle, is a blade said to have been created by the legendary Japanese blacksmith Amakuni during the 8th century AD. Its dual-edged blade makes it somewhat rare. According to Wikipedia at least, the Black Mortal Blade from Sekiro is in the same style, as is Mugen's from Samurai Champloo. The Onimaru, simply Demon, is another of the 5 great swords under heaven, just like Dojigiri. It was considered to be one of the 3 regalia swords of the shoguns of the Ashikaga clan. Who knows how Masashi got his hands on them, but they're in our hands now. It's kind of a shame the weapons aren't that good. They come with a unique special move, Moonlight Cyclone, which sees you going ham with the blades to inflict decent damage. Oh, and you obviously forfeit your other special moves in equipping them. The main issue with the swords, as we saw with Masashi himself, is that they lack range. They're the equivalent of that scene in The Simpsons where Bart's swinging his arms. Don't get me wrong, it works wonders within tight groups of enemies, effectively turning Kotaro into a human blender, but if an enemy has a little more range than you, it's often the case of foes hitting you while you slowly creep within scything distance. But you know who'd love to hear about our duel with Masashi? Yukinosuke. Remember him? Wonder how he's feeling. Let's pay him a visit. More human-looking soulbug hosts attempt to block Kataro's progress. The guys in the maroon Haori have a tad more health, but their movesets are practically the same as regular officials. The entrance we took to the dojo last time is now blocked. We're forced to head around to the other side, finding the dojo infested with undead warriors. Like squatters, they've taken up residence, so we've got to kick them out. Kataro diligently goes from room to room. The tight environment works in our favor thanks to Masashi's swords, and paints the walls. I'm surprised Yukinosuke had no one else living in the dojo. It's pretty spacious, unless they've all been transformed. Kataro locates the door to the dojo, but it's locked. Doubling back, you get one of the game's few, maybe only, jump scares. Zombies busting into Kendo's gun shop. This is not, and I think they missed an opportunity to make this a slightly more challenging enemy as opposed to the regular scrubs you'll have already slaughtered dozens of. In proceeding through the last few areas, you'll pick up a new weapon, the Masamune. I'm going to take a wild guess and say that as far as legendary Japanese swords go, most people know of the Masamune and the Muramasa from games like Final Fantasy or other fantasy-adjacent Japanese games. Goro Nyudo Masamune was one of Japan's most celebrated swordsmiths and made banger after banger. Unfortunately, I'm not exactly sure which of the named blades this one's supposed to be. With the key now in hand and our new blade in the other, we can unlock the dojo and confront Yukinosuke. Kataro's old friend is knelt on the floor, wrestling with a bout of nostalgia. He reflects on the two warriors as children. Despite all their duels, there was never a winner. Yukinosuke figures that with the soulbug parasite and his master's plans to not just take over Japan but the world, it's best they settle up. Kataro's stuck with no alternative but to draw his blade and oblige. The battle with Yukinosuke is probably my favourite in the game. Similar to when Lin fought Shin, it's a mirror battle of sorts. What's great about Yukinosuke is that he'll put to use all the same tricks that you have. Dodging, parrying, special moves, thrust. It's just night and day compared to the recent duel with Masashi, all backed by a sick soundtrack. This is what Ronin Blade's combat should have been like. Have more encounters where you're really forced to keep on your toes. There's such a tangible cadence to the fight, back and forth, finding an opening, waiting it out. It understands the rhythm of a duel, the ebb and flow. I don't want some old dude floating about like a deranged housefly or a giant monk crushing me under his stomach. I want this Jidaigeki clash of blades balancing on a knife edge. Yukinosuke crumples against the dojo wall, full of regret. Kataro's return was unexpected, if not unwelcome, and perhaps this whole mess would have turned out different if he'd never arrived at the dojo. But what's done is done. Yukinosuke always strove to succeed Kataro's swordsmanship and paid for it with his life. Though Kataro wishes the two could put this behind them and train once again, once someone's infected, that's it. All Kataro can do is avenge his friend. Despite Yukinosuke and the narrative as a whole not getting too much attention, I do like his character. From the moment you meet him, there's an aura of defeat and insecurity around him. His friends returned home just as Yukinosuke has been infected, and perhaps seeing the person that Kataro is plants the seed of doubt. The Ronin doesn't much care for war or being better than his friend, he just wants to live. In the end, Yukinosuke can only find release and validation in challenging his friend to a battle he knew he'd already lost. Last we saw Lin, she'd just been forced to kill her own brother Shin at the beach after Ryoda and Tojo scurried off back to their castle. Having just returned to the village, she finds it much like Kataro did, infested with those possessed by the soul bugs. This section plays out in much the same fashion as Kataro's bit of genocide. In addition to the ninja tools, we also have Raime. Having belonged to her brother Shin, it's capable of emitting lightning upon striking a foe, and its attacks are just as fast. With it, you're able to tear through the hordes of villagers shuffling towards you. You also gain a number of new special attacks, Crimson Phoenix, Flame Lily, and Night Queen, which requires a kunai and varying amounts of blue energy to cast. As projectile attacks, they're decent enough at tearing through big chunks of enemies. Where Lin's encounter with the villagers changes is in the final few foes that appear. There's a small scene after they've all scarpered off, replaced by what I assume are larger soul bugs having burrowed overground from below. Like any good snaky enemy, they will of course periodically dive underground, only to surface a moment later in an attempt to get you. Though these soul bugs have a boss's blue health bar, they are surprisingly brittle, and it doesn't take long to finish them off. It actually reminds me a lot of the fight with the Pale Widow in The Witcher 3, or any countless fight where you're up against Shai Hulud. If you do manage to slaughter more than 300 villagers, you will be rewarded with an infinite supply of kunai, which is great for cheesy strats. In both characters' chapter 6, they once again find themselves crossing paths at the Watchtower. Lin down a brother, Kotaro down a friend. The two catch each other up on the situation. Tojo's stole the gold, has been using the soul bugs to create an undead army that he plans to use to take over the world with, and they're the only two that have a chance of stopping him. Though Lin appears lost in grief at first, a good old snap out of it is able to sharpen her mind and prepare the two for the task ahead. I think I prefer Kotaro's line in the Japanese where he's like, "Don't you dare get yourself killed out there." Whereas in the English he's like, "Take care of yourself." The plan is that Kotaro kicks down the front door, whereas Lin will infiltrate from the rooftops. Now, there's not much to do, but there is still some stuff to do. The first is the owner of the glasses. This is the same dressmaker that Kotaro can save in his story. If you return the glasses, he'll let you switch up costumes. Like Kotaro, I was partial to the dark ninja garb. However, you can make her look like Sakura from Street Fighter, which is modelled on those Sailor Fuku uniforms. The final item to acquire is the blade that was aboard the ship, Rakuyo. You can search a nearby lamp in one of the pathways to obtain the helmet code letter. You then take this to the blacksmith, the same one Kotaro can visit. When you hand over the letter, Taka, the blacksmith, will tell you that Hanzo brought the blade to him after recovering it from the ship. This is Lin's most powerful weapon, and while you obtain Byakuya from defeating the mini sandworms, this blade's definitely an upgrade. The latter has quite slow attacking speed, which is unsuited for the new enemies roaming the area. These mantis-like creatures can hit hard and fast. Kotaro would not be having a good time with them. You really want to be strafing around these monsters and getting hits from behind, but they do love trying to pen you in. There's also another fleshy beastie that reminds me of the Licker from Resident Evil. Instead of its tongue elongating, the thing's neck does instead, like a meaty accordion. After plowing through a good number of the monsters, you'll find a new enemy type waiting for you at the gates of Tojo's castle. These spear guys love a poke. They have an annoying tendency to give Lin a couple of boops on the head to shave off her HP. Further along the path is another gate, but this one's for Kotaro. Lin, in the first instance in the game, has to scale an obstacle. Chunky stones will take her along the walls of the castle so she can traverse the rooftops. As you might expect, of course, there's going to be a bunch of ninja waiting to bar your path. By now, you should be well acquainted with the quick, strafing nature of Lin's playstyle and easily be able to side through them. Reflecting on it now, I do get some Sekiro vibes of scaling Ishina's castle and fighting the nightjars along the way, though I dare say Sekiro might have one-upped the version we see here. Ronin Blade walked, so Sekiro could run, obviously. After skulking along the walls, Lin finally arrives at a tower. This is the point of no return. There's nothing left to do but bring Tojo's attempted coup to an end. Let's hope Kotaro managed to hold up his side of the plan. At the Watchtower, Kotaro asks Yukinosuke to watch over him. The last memento he has of his friend is the Muramasa, the blade he wielded just before he died. No offense to Yukinosuke, but this sword is kind of ass. I'm sure it's just fine in the right hands, but they are not my hands. You can only commit a single strike with the blade, effectively attacking as the power of a 3-strike rolled into 1. The enemies around here are tough enough on Kotaro without any other handicap piled on, so I just switched it back up to Dojigiri. However, if you are not hamstringing yourself through wanting a speedy game experience, you can return to the blacksmith to pick up Nihon, the best sword in the game. No gimmicks with this one, it's super fast and brings the pain. If you've got it, then it'll carry you through the rest of the game, no problem. But you can get through without it just fine. A Ronin's keenest weapon will always be their wits, right? At Tojo Castle, Kotaro will encounter more souped up samurais. Aside from being able to attack quicker, very little should be testing you at this point in the game. You've seen it all before. Instead of the rooftops, Kotaro will bust straight on through the castle's main grounds. The environments are generally quite tight, lending itself to the enemy's advantage. Oftentimes, you'll be in a position where a guard's able to zip behind you and whip out the nothing personal kid, sending you back to the title screen. In fact, this was the closest Ronin Blade ever came to ratcheting up the tension and making it shift more into survival horror than action horror. About halfway through the castle, a couple of demon samurais had left me on a few pixels of health. Having already replayed this section a few times, I'd run out of health items ages ago. I was taking every single encounter as carefully as possible, never letting myself be forced into positions where my back was exposed, never trying to challenge more than one guard at a time. The moment I'd just managed to clear a screen and then charge into the next, I was constantly scouring the area for a white pouch. When your character gets low on health, you won't be able to run any longer. Kotaro can only shuffle forwards. There was that sense of Spike at the end of Cowboy Bebop, or when Snake's crawling down the microwave hallway in MGS4. I knew that just a single attack from an enemy would end up sending me right back to that flowery save point to attempt this uphill struggle anew. Eventually infiltrating the castle interior, Kotaro was still on his last legs. From on the wall, you can pick up the whole. The description claims the weapon is cursed in some form or another, but I don't know if that affects you or enemies, I don't know. Though he looked rather foolish, the quickest way to get around was by strafing everywhere. I thought I'd finally struck gold when entering a room full of the stuff, only to be beset upon by 3 ninjas. I was convinced this was it. To his credit, Kotaro was channeling some Zen swordsmanship and tore it up. Finally, after making it through, I found a precious bit of ointment and immediately started smearing it everywhere. With a little more breathing room, Kotaro now has to climb the stairs to reach the top floors of the castle. Bloodstains smear the shoji and floors. More zombified warriors clad in armor stand in your way. They all want a piece of the Ronin and are willing to gank you. Continuing through the castle's interior will be the biggest challenge you've faced so far. The game just keeps throwing enemies at you and isn't too generous with healing items until close to its end. Despite dying several times, it never frustrated me and I never felt the game was being unfair. It was just quite a difficulty spike. Though its combat is fairly simple and somewhat unrefined, there are moments which shine through that really boil down to risk management in encounters and being extremely judicious in your attacks. Those are the moments where Ronin Blade captures what the game does best. Which is why the final boss battle, with who else but Tojo, is a little disappointing. You find the grey-faced leader at the top of the castle ready to take you on, wielding a giant spear. Despite the two exchanging some words, both knew this was a situation that would only resolve itself with a clash of steel. If Kotaro fails now, then Tojo won't simply stop with controlling his fiefdom or Japan, he's in it for the world, and we live in that place. Tojo as a boss is underwhelming. His spear has reach, but he's more inclined to whack you over the head with it or pull off a little pirouette. His most annoying skill, and one often hated by those who play a lot of RPGs, is his ability to heal. Even if he's not low on health, he'll cover himself with an aura and start regaining hit points. And there's very little you can do to stop it. You can only attempt to outpace his regeneration with pure damage. When Kotaro struck the final blow, Lin will appear to evaluate his handiwork. Tojo is now dead, which means the threat of the soul bugs and their larger threat on the world has been defeated. Good job, hero. Lin asks what took so long, but then can't help wondering why all this felt a little too easy. I don't know if that was meant to throw shade at my earlier struggles reaching the top of the castle, but I will let it slide. The two leave, mission accomplished. Break open the sake. But then... Psych, I guess. That's technically Ronin Blade's first ending. Despite believing we'd killed Tojo and ended the threat, it doesn't quite seem the Lord's truly dead. Maybe there was something, or more likely someone, behind all of this. You can choose to start the game again with Kotaro and retain all that you acquired, or start with Lin to access the game's true ending. Lucky for us, we've already done the hard work. Technically, the true final chapter, it starts, at least from a narrative standpoint, just a little before this chapter, with Lin having reached the top of the tower via her ninja acrobatics. When you enter, you will find Kotaro standing over the fresh corpse of Tojo. After commenting that it seems all too easy, Tojo's body stirs. His eviscerated corpse shudders to life once again, transforming into an even more grotesque multi-limbed creature akin to, hey, you guessed it, a Rakshasa. I believe it may be Ravana, the main antagonist of the Legend of Ramanya, which, along with multiple arms, had multiple heads too. The resurrected Tojo's arms are filled with some familiar weaponry from throughout the game, giving off a very Gilgamesh vibe. It's a cool looking boss. Shame, like his previous incarnation, he kinda sucks. Lin is rapid and, armed with Rakio, will absolutely slice this guy up like sashimi. His attacks may be powerful, especially if he manages to get a good hit in with his sword-filled arms, but you can just hop out of the way fairly easily. Armed with a spin attack and fireball blast, the latter leaves him extremely vulnerable to back attacks. He has a tendency to cast on Wake Up, so it's just a simple job of hacking him down again and again. When Tojo has hopefully breathed his last, a set of stairs will just appear in the center of the room. A voice calls out for the two to approach. Wonder who's waiting for us up top now. You get one last chance to save before confronting the real villain of the game, none other than Ryu Oda. Tojo has been nothing more than a puppet moving under the great military strategist's influence. As long as he lives, so too will the soul bugs. Compelled by the power of the soul bugs to dance a jig, purple light erupts from Oda as he transforms into the ultimate being, a weird, multi-faced bug thing. The final question you have to answer is, who's going to take him down? Considering Kataro has barely made it through thus far and was running on fumes, while Lin had more herbs on her than a dispensary, the answer was obvious. Lin swears to avenge her brother by felling this god bug. As far as Ronin Blade's battles with non-humanoid characters go, this is the best you're going to get. The arena is quite tight, and the skittering sound effect that accompanies Oda as he skirts around the area is pretty creepy. Those long limbs have a fair bit of range on him, and he's also partial to some magic, like the classic laser beam across the ground before an explosion. If you manage to get a good enough look at his pixelated form, you can just about make out this eldritch baby nestled in his center. Its final form reminds me of Bizarro Sephiroth. You honestly don't even need the best weapon or a surfeit of items to come out the other side of this battle victorious. If you pick Lin, you're just too damn quick and can constantly pressure Oda to relinquish any opening he tries to take. In the end, Ronin Blade probably features more underwhelming boss encounters than surprisingly refreshing ones. With the final blow against Oda struck, you bet he's going to explode in a giant fireball. Cross that one off your bingo card, along with the entire castle deciding to collapse for no apparent reason. With the place set to come down around their heads, Kataro getting flashbacks of that cave, they'd best make a swift exit. Kataro wraps his arms around Lin, glancing at the ocean below before they leap from the balcony. More than likely they'd make it a good few meters before invariably becoming a bloody paste on the castle grounds below, but we can suspend our disbelief for this one. Cut to a sunny day, Lin atop a cliff edge, Shin's bandana in her hand. It flutters in the breeze for a moment before being swept towards the ocean. I say swept towards the ocean, it honestly looks like someone off screen yanked it away on a fishing line, but this is PS1 era CG we're dealing with. The credits then roll before we get one final scene. Kataro's waiting atop a bridge we saw him cross in the game's hype trailer, I think. Rin appears from behind a tree. No idea who she was trying to fool because there's just like a single tree. She must have ninja run down the road when Kataro wasn't looking and hid there, but she offers Kataro a wave before rushing towards him, bringing an end to Ronin Blade. Now that we're done going through the game itself, let's break up some of those parts and examine them. The narrative is definitely Ronin Blade's most interesting facet. I was scouring my brain to think of a similar Jidaigeki sci-fi horror setting, but coming up short. Oftentimes the work set during this period leans hard into the folklore and ghost stories, while Ronin Blade is quite restrained in that respect, low sci-fi or low fantasy. Its interesting concept wasn't something that escaped viewers at the time, with survival horror adjacent games being labelled as Resident Evil but X, just as with films like Die Hard and its contemporaries being Die Hard on an X. Because Ronin Blade is relatively short, the horror elements don't get time to bake. Their hints along the way are there, whether it's Yukinosuke's visit from Oda, the corpses in the shrine, or just something off about the lawmen, but you're constantly barreling through them. Kataro and Lin could have been more three-dimensional than they were, the blasé Ronin balanced by the supposedly naive Kunoichi. The relationships were set up for them, whether it's Yukinosuke or Shin, but you can literally go from knowing that you have a brother to slaughtering him within 40 minutes. It's understandable, perhaps the budget just wasn't there, or the development timeline too harsh. Likewise, the rest of the cast receives the same treatment. There are only a handful of scenes with the likes of Yukinosuke, Shin, Oda and Tojo, with Yukinosuke probably getting the longer end of the stick. It's probably so frustrating because I was on board and interested with the story the game wanted to tell. Like, where do the soul bugs come from? Urabe is a sorcerer, so did he somehow create them in the grotto under the shrine? Are they alien? Ryu Oda is then able to mimic or recreate whatever Urabe has been doing, so is it not founded in sorcery? Magic is established as real because Urabe wields it. The closest thing I could find to an explanation is kodoku, curse poison. This is Wikipedia and some funky sites, so your mileage may vary. Quote, to create kodoku, sorcerers would mix several insects in a jar and let them kill one another until only one survived. The fluids of the insect that survived would be used to poison an individual with a curse that would control them, cause them misfortune, or kill them. The term kodoku can also be applied to the spirit, which is the incarnation of this particular magic, which usually appears in the shape of a worm or other animal." End quote. So perhaps that's what we're dealing with here. There was a particularly interesting exchange of users on curiousordinary.com. "Evil woman, I will try it. Curious apprentice, did you succeed? Concerned citizen, uh-oh, I think we're safe. But soulbugs, let's say a mixture of Chinese magic and some science then." It's somewhat difficult to evaluate Ronin Blade's combat system, not because it's overly complex, but because you need to decide which lens you're examining the game through. With the tank controls and fixed camera angles, are you judging it based on other games that fit the mold? Do I find the combat system better than Silent Hill? Of course. But better than Resi 1 and 2 and 3? Well, yeah, but those games had a ton of other stuff going on that made them excellent. The closest comparison to Ronin Blade that I wouldn't even say fits the genre but gets lumped in with it is Nightmare Creatures. It's a horror game that puts the emphasis on combat with some mild puzzling and resource management. In that same vein, you never feel underpowered in Nightmare Creatures. If we were to chart a line of PSX survival horror titles by how action orientated they were, I'd place something like Clock Tower on the far left of the scale, Resi 2 in the center, and Nightmare Creatures and Ronin Blade on the far right of the scale. We could get really granular with this thing, but I am not a survival horror expert, so I'll leave it at that. But if you're viewing Ronin Blade through the survival horror lens, coming in for an experience more akin to something at the far left or center, you might be slightly disappointed. You spend far more time hacking away at enemies than puzzling, avoiding combat, or being a target. You are the hunter, not the hunted. I view Ronin Blade as more action oriented, so I judge it on those merits. I slightly prefer Nightmare Creatures combat and the variation in combos and items, but I am a sucker for samurais and ninjas. There are moments where you get a glimpse of what combat could have been in the game. For Kitaro, it's those one-on-one duels like with Yukinosuke, trying to capture the feeling of a lone wolf and cub film, dodging, parrying, the moments where you're both sizing each other up. For Lin, her best moments operate at another end of the spectrum, where there are multiple enemies and she's forced to strafe in and around opponents, utilizing her ninja tools, always being aware of her surroundings. If Konami had perhaps modeled encounters to more fit each character's individual playstyle, it could have created a more distinct and engaging combat experience. As it stands, I was never pressed into utilizing each character's special attacks because it always felt like that mega elixir you were saving for an ultimate boss, a situation where you absolutely had to break it out. That instant death counter though, now that I can get on board with. There's something so satisfying about pulling it off, and Ronin Blade is pretty generous with the timings. If a game implements a counter system, you bet I am going to use it every chance I can. In those moments, just like in Sekiro or Bayonetta or any game with the mechanic, getting it right is its own reward. Ronin Blade does try to shake it up with each character's weapons. While I appreciate the odd elemental effect and general attack increase, you do obtain new weapons at a fair clip. Not that I'm complaining, there was an opportunity to shake up combat. Dual wielding and the single draw swords are interesting in concept, but they're just a little too awkward in the end. Lin, unfortunately, really doesn't get a look in with weapons. The biggest factor is often the speed and number of attacks, but this is rectified somewhat with her increased number of special moves and the breadth of items she can employ. What we've got is a combat system where you're not forced to think too much. You can hack up enemies in the open with abandon. Where the game does start to truly test you is in that final assault on the castle, and it's the most thrilling part of Ronin Blade. But maybe that's fine. The game's what? An hour and a half long, and that's being generous. Maybe it's just one of those games you can fire up and clear in an afternoon, and that's not a bad thing. I suppose it's a little disappointing because there weren't really many slower paced action games, particularly Eastern in flavour, on the PSX. Rising Zan had a faster pace, and Bushido Blade veered more towards one-on-one arena fighting. I don't know, I'm just saying it seemed like a more thoughtful action game, which took some of the lessons from survival horror. Could have been quite cool. Ronin Blade comes the closest to that, well, until obviously Onimusha came along and just, as we've said, did everything better. Your combat system's only as good as the opponents you're pitted against though, right? Or is it the other way around? I'll never tire of hacking down the scrubby lawmen in the game. They're ideal wheat to scythe under Kitaro or Lin's blades. Ronin Blade does attempt to inject some variety into various threats on your journey, whether they're humanoid, bestial, or even flying. The issue comes when you can boil down the majority of foes to it's X with a sword. The way in which you approach the first lawman, to the grotesque mutated warriors, to the armor-clad samurai in the castle, all require the same approach. Rush in and attack, deflect a strike for a counter, maintain good distance. It's not simple in a good way, however, it just lacks depth. While you might see an increase in enemies in one area to compensate for this, it doesn't quite materialize. You may encounter 4 at most in larger arenas, but those moments where a higher number of enemies are packed into a smaller environment can be quite thrilling. Ronin Blade does try to shake it up with ninjas and the increased speed and projectiles, or the crab-like enemies in their pincers, but it doesn't quite go far enough. Sure, later on in the castle, a few foes might have some special attacks that can hit hard, but it's too little too late by that point. It's not like I'm angry at the game, just disappointed. I've said it once and I'll say it again, but the final castle level is where Ronin Blade's encounters are at their peak. Enemies hit hard, placements feel more deliberate, and encounter variety has been mixed up, taking advantage of the various combinations of different attacking styles. If it could have done that earlier, and with a greater variety, combat could have been a much more compelling experience. As it stands, it's serviceable, providing just enough that I never felt it outstayed its welcome, thanks to the game's relatively short runtime. The soundtrack and by extension Yasuhisa Ito really make Ronin Blade what it is. Perhaps because of the influence at the time, it has this techno-industrial rock sound that would honestly complement a game like the first Yakuza or the track mode video for Tekken 3. When I hear the different snippets of the game's OST, it invokes vivid thoughts of them being in other games. So here's a quick compilation, see what you think. And that is by no means throwing some sort of shade on the OST, it just evokes this sense that it's bigger than the game itself. Someone else composing the soundtrack for the game could have focused on creating much more traditional pieces. Just look at how Onimusha built its soundtrack. Don't get me wrong, great music, but it's no more than what you would expect. You would think that to have music so at odds with the setting might feel out of place, but sometimes it's just so damn funky that I love it. I can't help bobbing my head every time I'm running through the forest with that funky guitar riff as Lin folds a bunch of ninja, mixing the old with the relatively new, or the cheeky chaotic piece that comes with whacking Yukinosuke over the head for as long as you want before the dojo master breaks it up, or how the individual boss music is so hype with chunky guitar riffs crunching out an amp. It's as if Ito took a sheet from Dynasty Warriors' book to sneak in an industrial metal album into the OST. What you're left with is a really eclectic soundtrack that feels handcrafted to sell like a vibe or emotion. I'm not the first and I won't be the last to extol the aesthetic vibe of pre-rendered backgrounds. Ronin Blade isn't the example you present when you're trying to wow the uninitiated or the evidence you'd wield when making a case for them, but that's not to say they're lacking. When you talk about pre-rendered backgrounds in general, most people's minds are drawn to the likes of the Final Fantasy series, Legend of Dragoon, Resident Evil, Chrono Cross, yada yada, and for good reason. That tech was a superb way to realize the fantastical with the hardware constraints of the time. For Ronin Blade, while its story may not be grounded, the world in which it's set is. This juxtaposition allows the moments of horror to better contrast the mundane setting. Kataro's village is just your regular era-appropriate locale. It's got the houses, the alleys, the dummy thick populace. There's a strong sense of culture and authenticity in the places you visit, whether it's a friend's dojo, a shrine, even a castle. This allows those moments of the macabre to really puncture the seeming normality of the village, like the first time you enter the shrine and encounter a bloodied heap of limbs backed by a droning soundtrack, or the underground grotto with its corpses littering the ground and shallow waters. It's the clutter in the forests, finding shrines and planks of wood, the huts by the beach with the fish drying on racks outside. When you go into the castle and the glow from the gold is so overwhelming because there's just so much of the stuff piled high. Just because the location is quite grounded, that doesn't mean the art direction and scene composition has to be. Other games may have done it better, but Ronin Blade still deserves a seat at the table. There are quite some significant changes when Ronin Blade made its journey to foreign shores, some practical, others somewhat more subjective. The most obvious would be the game's various names. In Japanese, we had Rasetsu no Ken, Blade of the Rakshasa. In the US, Soul of the Samurai, and in Europe, obviously Ronin Blade. You'll see this most prominently in the game's title screen. Another strange choice was to change the kunoichi's name. In Japanese, it's Rin. Rin is a unisex name, but it's often transliterated to Lin. I don't know, but Lin always sounded more Chinese to me because there's no specific L sound in Japanese. Maybe at the time, it would have sounded strange to Western ears, but Lin, like Lindsay or something, wouldn't have. If you're doing it again this day and age, I'd imagine they'd probably have stuck with the original name. Other changes include the save files looking more like Tanzaku, I believe, I may be wrong. These strips of paper are used to write poetry on, which is then hung on bamboo. As you will have seen, the writing is in the more traditional right-to-left reading orientation, with the person reading from top to bottom. There's also the UI for the pause menu, which uses 4 diamonds instead of the more boring floating boxes. I assume this was done in order to be more explicit about what each option was, because the Japanese has kanji, as well as the affordance of vertical text to display info when you hover over the icons. The remaining subtler changes would be the chapter introductions, which do look more authentic, I guess, but I do kind of prefer the ones in the non-Japanese version. So mostly subtle tweaks here and there, and a far cry from some of the 1.1 versions of games we received after that localization time was often used to tighten up mechanics or fix bugs. Soul bugs. So when you boil down all the bugs in a jar, throw in a few kooky characters, a sprinkling of serviceable combat, and relatively little replay value, all simmered in short playtime, what are you left with? What does that taste like? I don't know, insects are high in protein but probably not too delicious. You've got a game that for most people would just be fine or a little underwhelming. I kinda like it though. Ronin Blade's got something that just sets it apart from anything on the PSX at the time. Yeah, it stumbles in a number of regards, but the concept hooked me, and the mindless combat allows me to just switch off my brain. I treat it like a run through Streets of Rage or Final Fight or even Dynasty Warriors, a bit of mindless fun. As someone who enjoys Jidaigeki and the game's whole aesthetic, if you treat Ronin Blade like you're playing through an hour-and-a-half film, not as a poor Resi clone or an action game that's too slow, it's fun. Assuming a game plays into certain conventions and letting that colour your opinion and expectations is only natural though. If you actually fancied paying money for this game back in the day, it would have been around £39.99. For context, with an inflation calculator, the total in £19.99, that would have been the equivalent of £73.79 and, going by the exchange rate at the time, around $114. That is crazy. Would Ronin Blade have been worth over £70 at the time? Absolutely not. These days, as of 2024, if you look the game up on eBay, it's around 20 to 25 quid. It seems more reasonable if you can get a copy in decent condition, but if you fancy spending an afternoon with a proto Onimusha that perhaps offers a different experience to general survival action horror, you could do worse with titles in the same vein, like that trash Men in Black game. If anyone enjoyed Ronin Blade as much as I did, please let me know, and if you want to like or subscribe, go for it. Until next time, take it easy.